Hello, and welcome back to AP Human Geography. Today I want to talk about the great storytellers, the myths, the legends, the folktales, and the fables, what they are, and how geography influences them. So first let's talk about what are we talking about, right? It's traditional literature is what we're focusing on, and it can be written or oral. But this is going to be what we think of as folklore, right, is kind of half the conversation. And we, I think, in the modern times really think about cultural folk tales, right? Mythology as being all the same thing, but they're not. We really have two categories. We've got folklore and then we have myths. And folklore is what you're really familiar with. It's the fairy tales, folk tales, and fables. But then myths come in two types. You have your etiological myths, which are going to be things about creation, the afterlife. They're going to involve deities, and I'll talk about that more in just a second. And then you have your heroic myths. But whatever we're talking about, all of these stories teach values. They share morals and norms of the culture, and they give an explanation for the unknown so you can understand the world around you better. So let's start with the fairy tales and folk tales. Not that they're of lesser importance, it's just that they don't have as much gravity as myths do, right? When we talk about fairy tales and folk tales, we're talking about fictional stories. Almost every culture has them. I'm not an expert, but I can't think of any cultures that don't. Fairy tales and folk tales are often associated with children. They're for teaching lessons to children. Their characters are going to be humans, number one, but there's going to be a lot of supernatural characters. And in this case, I don't mean supernatural like outside the natural, like we were talking about when we were talking about rituals. I'm talking about things like fairies and elves and, witches and things like that. And these are the things that you think of when you think of fairy tales, right? Like the Disney princesses and stuff. And we are not minimizing the importance of fairy tales and folk tales. It's just that in this conversation, we're going to focus mostly on myths. And in class, we're going to focus on myths because you are going to be writing a myth for the culture that you have chosen. So, let's talk about myths more. Heroic myths, sometimes these are called legends, right? These are going to be stories about people. They ideally take place sometime within human history. They are relatable. The people are there um, to inspire confidence in the culture. They are there to be role models. They really have qualities that give them some truth, even though they may be fantastic stories. Ultimately, the job of the heroic myth is really a psychological exploration of what it takes to become a better person, right? But there's also a certain amount of social commentary in there, and sometimes there's social commentary in folklore as well, but this is where you're really going to have that piece as we're thinking about recording history. Legends, heroic myths do some of that, right? They are also found in all cultures. Their content is really about miracles and amazing feats of intelligence, of strength, of character, right? That sort of thing. They're real people going through imaginary events. They're often larger than life kind of thing. You can think of the trials of Odysseus or Beowulf, even Robin Hood, which sort of crosses the line between a folk tale and a legend, but his character, right, is this thing that's exaggerated and is the role model, so it works. Now, I just want to highlight the tall tale because this is a truly American thing. This is part of American folk literature, and we have a special kind of legend where oftentimes we take real people, right? Sometimes they're fictional people, sometimes they're real people. Paul Bunyan, not real. Davy Crockett, Johnny Appleseed, yes, real. Okay. So although his name wasn't really Johnny Appleseed. I think it was John Chapman, actually. But that's not important. What's important is that these are all about hard work. Their style is humorous. They're full of hyperbole. They have seemingly impossible feats like, lassoing a tornado, having a giant blue ox, whatever. But the fact is that they are to highlight the idea of hard work being the path to success, right? And they are very specific. Like I said, they are truly American. They are told in a way that the person who is telling the story was actually there. And so there's this sense of realism, and there's a bigger connection in that way. Okay. Now, the next thing we're going to talk about are fables, and fables are another subset of folklore. These are really short stories. They oftentimes don't actually have a plot. They're found in almost every culture as well, and they usually contain little kind of a lot of times they're animals, actually, interestingly enough, but they always have a moral. So it's some little kind of a vignette, if you will, and there's a lesson about how to live your life in a way that will allow you to be a good person and be successful. Sometimes there's supernatural, sometimes there's people, but mostly it's animals, right? And Aesop's fables, the Panchatantra are all really good examples of those. Now, within fables, there are the trickster tales, and trickster tales you also find in lots of places around the world, and they always have a paradox in them. There is some immoral character, oftentimes the coyote, if you're talking about in the United, like here in the Americas, it's going to be the coyote. They will do some sort of immoral action, and they may in fact be successful at it. But through that immoral action, something happens in the end to teach the moral of the story, like what is the moral code that we should be following. And these are also really interesting, kind of sort of not a do this way, this is the path of righteousness, if you will, right? This is a don't be like this person, or in this case, this animal. Again, a lot of times animals. Okay, so let's talk about our etymological myths. This is where we're going to spend the bulk of the time in this conversation here in this recording. In class, we'll be talking about the heroic myths more. We're going to analyze the hero's journey, and we'll talk about that in a second. But etymological myths are the sacred narratives. They explain the relationship between humans and the divine. Oftentimes they're talking about how the world or people came to be to begin with, right? Again, almost all cultures, they originally, like folktales and fairy tales, passed through an oral tradition, but they're some of the first things to really be recorded because they are the important things. They are closely linked to the religion of the culture, and they explain why stuff happens. They also, in some ways, establish models for behavior, but mostly they're talking about the story of the people, right? They always involve gods and supernatural heroes. Okay, so here's your first question. One, and maybe controversial, distinction between myth and folklore is that folklore is only about nature gods before the arrival of the one true God. Folklore is about more humble people, including kings, fairies, witches, but not about gods and goddesses. Folklore stories contain music and songs. Folklore is not based on historical fact, as is myth. Well, to narrow it down, only one of these things is true, and that is folklore tends to be more about people, the lesser beings, if you will, but myths are about gods and goddesses' deity. Yeah. And so why are myths important? Myths use metaphor to explain higher concept, right? Many stories have monsters, in which case you're talking about how to overcome danger, how to overcome fear. Sometimes they always have gods and goddesses. These are the protective, beings, the creators, the path that you have to follow to rejoin whoever that is. The thing is, though, that the metaphors always have to fit their culture, and that is going to be based on the people that are there and their experiences. And their experiences are dictated by geography, because geography will set the climate, it will set the landscape, it will set the vegetation that they have access to, it will determine the ecosystems that are there, so what they're seeing. So geography is really at the heart of the structure of the myth within a particular culture, right? And metaphors really do these metaphors in these myths are things that are universally acknowledged thoughts, right, and images. They're things that everyone can hear and understand, or at least within your culture, right? But there's something that's universal, and oftentimes they're universal. You can hear someone else's myth and you totally get it, right? Because they're kind of universal that way. Again, it's about geography. So if you think about a lot of the Japanese myths, they are an island. So here's your example. They're an island, so they have a lot to do with fish, oceans, right? Mountains, because they're a mountainous island. If you look at Midwest Native American tribes, they don't have anything to do with the ocean. They have to do with winds and sky and rocks and open plains and dry, right? And so it really is interesting to look and see those relationships, yeah? So here's the other thing about myths. It's really about the relationship between humans and the divine, okay? Whether it's the convergence of those two things or the divergence of those two things. And ultimately, the word myth derives from the word mythos, which means mycene, monstrous, imaginary, utterance, or magical. I don't know why magical is not capitalized. Sorry about that. It means utterance, right? And so myth, the word myth, really starts with the idea of the creation myth. And a creation myth defines the roles of everyone in the culture, everyone in the ecosystem, everything in the world, right? And maybe even interactions with other cultures. But ultimately, we need to explain stuff. We need to have control and understanding over the world around us. All right, so what are the common patterns in myths? Creation, right? That is a metaphor for birth, but it's really about how we came to be. The apocalypse. When things go wrong, there will be some ritual cleansing of the old and you will have creative destruction. Oftentimes, when you're talking about the apocalypse, you have a flood or fire situation, and that is where you're restoring order. From chaos can often result in creation. What happens when you die? The afterlife, right? Who's actually in charge of everything? The pantheons of the gods, right? These are the symbols of the ultimate reality. The hero's journey, which is about character development through the struggles of your life, and they all involve some sacred place or object that holds some symbolic significance. So think about these things as you are writing your myth. And you will be writing a creation myth. And so I want to talk a little bit about creation myths. There's lots of kinds of, we just talked about all the different kinds of myths, but a lot of myths center around creation, right? And so there's really kind of two ideas. You've got creation from nothing and creation from something, right? So we're going to start with creation from nothing. This is basically the universe exists and there is the mind, the thought of a god, right, of some sort, yeah? And so out of nothing, ex nihilo or de novo, right, out of nothing, the new, something comes into being. Or you start with not nothing, but you start with chaos, and the god will organize the chaos. And these are particularly popular in monotheistic religions, but not necessarily, right? But that is where you see most of them. And ultimately, your God figure will create the universe from nothing or out of chaos by thought, word, or breath. Okay? And so, probably one of the ones that you're most familiar with is the idea of the mind or breath of God. And God said, "Let there be light," right? And now you have it. So the Supreme Being speaks the word and cosmic order arrives. Now, in this PowerPoint, you definitely want to look at this PowerPoint because with all of these pictures, I have put in the stories that go with each of them, and you should take a look at those. And because I don't want to spend lots and lots of time going over each myth, but they're very cool and they will give you some good ideas as you are writing your own myth. Okay. Then there's Deus Faber, which is the idea of the grand architect, the constructor of the universe. And this goes to the idea of organizing chaos, right? And again, please look at the different ideas. But it may be one of those things where you are having a combination of something already exists and we're creating man from the thing that exists, or we're just organizing this chaos into the world and then we create people. Yeah. Okay, the other thing that you can see a lot is the God exists and a universe exists, but it is the sacrifice of a god or goddess that creates what we see today. This is the idea of creative destruction. It's renewal through death. It is that in order to create something huge, to bring in new life, the cost of the new life is the old life, right? And this will include things like creation by dismemberment, where the divine is actually cut up by a monster or other gods and distributed around the world, and that's actually what creates stuff. But again, read through the myths that I have in the notes. Okay, so here's your next question. In myths of the separation of the earth and the sky, because a lot of times you'll see that you start out with earth and sky. The sky is always female, the earth is always female, it is necessary to sacrifice the children, all of these or none of these. When you see the separation of earth and sky, the earth is always female. Right? It turns out the sky is male, the earth is female, and that is typically how it goes. And usually what happens is you have some consummation of the relationship between the earth and the sky. And sometimes it's symbolic, sometimes they actually have an actual gender, but you'll see this a lot. It is the marriage of the male and the female that create the world, right? And sometimes sort of in that line with birth, like consummation and birth, you'll have eggs. Either you have the two creators get together and one of them lays an egg, or the cosmos starts out as an egg and we get a hatching of that egg. Either way, the egg hatches and stuff comes out of it. Typically, you have silver or gold eggs, which is kind of an interesting thing. Oftentimes the silver refers to the moon, and that's the feminine, and the gold refers to the sun, and that's masculine. You also have this idea of division. So on the one hand, you have the consummation, and on the other hand, you have the division. Oftentimes a younger god has to separate these two beings, or split the cosmic egg itself to create the new world. All right, now on that idea of birth and emergence, sometimes the world just is born out of a mother figure. Now, sometimes it's about trial and error. The god creates something, it's bad, they destroy it, and then they do something else. They create something, they destroy it, they do something else until they get it right. And so the interesting thing about the trial and error idea is there's always that threat, and this is a behavioral control thing, there's always that threat that if you're not doing the right thing, the deity, the divine, will come and destroy the world, right? And if you look at Christian stories, that the earth has already been destroyed by flood, and in the future it will be destroyed by fire if people can't get it together, right? And so this is kind of an interesting thing. So this destruction cycle very heavily lays the foundation for what the behavior of the culture should be. Okay. The last one that we want to talk about in terms of people gods, right, is the two creators. Yeah. In the case of the two creators, so what we've been talking about is that the God figures themselves create out of themselves in some way, and so that's what we've been doing. I like the two creator myths a lot personally because lots of myths, not just creation myths, have to deal with this yin and yang idea, the light, the dark, the good, the evil, the creation and the destruction. Duality is inherent in nature, and it's very important to us in particular because on the one hand, humanity is the most gracious, the most kind. We rush to help each other in need. And on the other hand, we are capable of the most heinous acts against each other and against nature. And there is this duality within us, right? Our baser nature and our brighter angels, right? And so this is a very interesting thing. So you'll see this throughout lots and lots of myths, this duality of nature. It is universal. Okay, now, sometimes you don't create out of the divine itself. The divine has some sort of substance, a primordial substance that it uses to create stuff. Oftentimes, you're going to begin with water, chaos stuff, darkness as a thing, mud, right, whatever. But you've got a substance, and that substance gives rise to whatever it is. And a lot of times, it's going to deal with earth. There are two big kind of categories here. You have that people are created from clay or mud or something like that, and then you have the land or life itself is created from mud in water. And that's where you get kind of the earth diver idea. And the possible sources for these are, of course, that clay and mud are building materials, and that you have the earth is the feminine. It's the divine feminine. It is the mother of all. It gives life to plants. It gives life to everything, right? So, by the way, in the earth diver idea, just as a kind of statement on that, what you'll have is the god will either dive down into the water themselves, or you'll have them direct an animal to dive down into the water. So perhaps it's a duck that goes down, gets some mud, comes back up, right? Whatever. Or a turtle or something like that. Okay, so what do they all have in common? When you're looking for archetypal commonalities of myths, right, there are character archetypes. You have these very kind of stock characters and deity roles. So as you're writing your myth, think about that. Oftentimes, you'll have elements and cardinal directions that are symbolic and they relate to each other. They will represent values, personality traits, and aspects of creation. There's also a lot of importance in the numbers that are used in myths. If you think about popular numbers, they're going to be things like 1, 2, 3, 5, 7, 9, 12, 40. Those are all big numbers that you see in lots of cultures. You'll have a male-female component oftentimes. Even if it's you start with a genderless deity, you'll see very quickly that duality in nature arises. The male, the female, the light, the dark, right? The good, the evil, all those things. Not that I'm saying that male and female equates to light and dark and good and evil. That's not what I'm saying. I'm just saying that you see themes of duality throughout everything. And don't forget that there are also cultural and moral values. The folk portions, the instruction and the expectations for the behaviors of the people in the culture are really, really important. Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit and let's talk about nature, right? Because all these myths are going to deal with nature. So let's talk a little bit about animals. I want to give you some examples. But basically, when we're looking at seeing ourselves in the world around us, we like to anthropomorphize animals and natural features to give us a sense of understanding of the world. Animals represent all kinds of human attributes, right? They also represent social relationships. And so we can see a lot of times we'll pair things in opposites, but ultimately we look at all of these animals, right? Because animals have personalities that we can observe, so they typically play the same role in all cultures. True or false? Animals do have personalities that we can observe, right? Or at least we think that they have personality traits that we can observe. A lot of that is projection, right? But they don't typically play the same role in all cultures, and so this is false. A particular animal may play one role in one culture and another role in another culture. And here's an example. I'm just going to give you a couple of kind of big animals that come up a lot in the things that we talk about or that happen to be sort of more global than others. You can pick any animal actually and talk about it. The animals, every animal shows up in some myth sometime somewhere, okay? But I'm going to start with ravens and crows because they actually run the gamut. And they oftentimes are really a representative of change, right? Death and rebirth. In Native American stories, they're the mediator between life and death. Sometimes they're a trickster or a thief, right? In Europe, right, in Northern Europe and Scotland, Ireland, areas like that, they're actually harbingers of death. They are death personified. And an interesting thing about ravens is that they're very smart, actually. They probably became associated with death because when they would see or hear soldiers on horseback or marching to battle, they would start to show up wherever they stopped. And so they would wait at the edge of battlefields because they had associated armor with and swords with death, and they're carrion feeders, so they eat dead stuff. And so they're smart enough to do that. So they're really smart, and they're kind of interchangeable. Crows and ravens are actually different species, but they're interchangeable there. But in some cases, they're also considered noble, right? In Norse mythology, they are the companions of Odin. They are thought and memory. So they're the recording of history, right? In Bhutan, there's actually a raven, you can see it, sitting on the crown of the king of Bhutan because they are protection there. And so you see lots of different kinds of attributes put on different animals in different cultures, partly because of the way that they behave, but partly because of the value systems of those cultures, right? Now, let's talk about something that's not real. Let's talk about dragons, right? Dragons around the world take different forms. When you look at South American dragons, they're often feathered, right? And some Asian dragons are actually feathered too. But South American dragons are very bird-like. Well, this is rainforest, right? You've got lots and lots of birds and things, yeah? In Europe, they're more lizardy, right? They're more snaky and things like that. They're also evil. Whereas in Asia, sometimes they're good, sometimes they're bad. Asian dragons can actually be really beneficial. Interestingly enough, they are universal, more or less, right? You see dragons all over the world. So the question becomes where? Well, here is a dragon skull. Or is it? So this is an interesting thing. In our quest to explain the natural world, we have things that no longer exist, like dinosaurs. Dinosaur skulls and bones are probably the origin for dragons. And then the things that are around us or scare us are the things that we apply. If it's a scary thing, right? Dragon was a scary thing, so we apply things in nature that scare us. If the dragon's not a scary thing, then we just apply what we see in nature, the animals that we see around us, and that's how we create dragons. It's a very interesting thing. Okay, so which of the following would be an example of convergent evolution influencing culture? Ravens offer protection in Bhutan but represent death in Scotland. Dragons are like birds in South America but like lizards in Europe. Jackals replace the coyotes from Native American stories in Africa, or all of these are a product of convergent evolution. The answer to this would be the one about jackals. Coyotes and jackals fill the same niche. Convergent evolution has acted on those two species to make them very similar, even though they are different species. So coyotes are another big one. They're often tricksters. Sometimes they're teachers and helpers. You see them a lot in Native American stories. They play huge roles. But here's the thing. In places where you don't have coyotes, you see jackals, right? Jackals in Africa, and you see foxes in Asia and Europe. But interestingly enough, almost across the board, the majority of the time, they're tricksters. And that kind of has to do with the nature of coyotes. All right, so when we look at all of these animals, we write all these stories about animals. They're very important to us, but they can be even more than that. They are sacred, right? And the idea of the animal is often more sacred than the animal itself, right? So think about clans. Almost every clan, one, claims its lineage from something divine, right? Or something heroic. Yeah. But they almost always have some sort of animal that represents them, and that animal is as important as the clan itself. Okay, so let's shift to just nature, right? We find gods in and the divine in all kinds of things in nature. Mountains are a big one, right? We often imagine that gods live in these mountains that are inaccessible to us or hard to access to us, right? And so these are places where we see Mount Olympus, right? Pele lives in the volcano. When she's angry, it erupts, right? So we have lots of legends about that. We also do lots of things with trees, and in particular the world trees or the cosmic trees, because people really view the tree with its roots into the earth and its branches touching the sky as a link between our world and the supernatural world, right? And so many times trees, particular species in some cases, but sometimes just trees in general, are going to play a really big role in the myths of the area. And then just here are some trees that you can see, right? Sacred trees of world mythology. But then it's not just here on Earth. We look to the sky. There are lots of sun gods and goddesses, and they are life forces, their creation, their power, their light, their heat, right? By the same token. By the way, most of the sun gods, many, many, many sun gods are male, right? Then we look at the moon. And the moon is about the cycle of creation, destruction as it waxes and wanes across the sky. Oftentimes we see moon goddesses rather than moon gods. I mean, there are moon gods, but the lunar cycle is heavily linked with menstruation. And so the moon is also about fertility, about beauty, about magic, and because it waxes and wanes, oftentimes death. And then don't forget about the stars. If you are Aboriginal, your ancestors live in the stars. Lots of cultures actually have people going into the stars to then watch their cultures. The Zulu, for instance, in southern Africa, say that the stars are the eyes of their ancestors watching them. And so really important. Also, stars have been important to us in the idea of telling what time of year it is, predicting when the flood seasons are going to come, and things like that. And so we're very closely aligned historically with stars, and so less about gods and goddesses and more about ancestors and the cycles of life. Okay, so I have talked about a lot of things in this lecture, and we will talk about more in class, but if you have any questions about anything I've talked about this time, please ask at the beginning of class, and then when I see you, we will discuss the hero's journey, and we will travel the path of the hero together. All right, thanks for listening. I will see you next time.